We're going to get started, and some people might be wondering later. My name is Karina Love. I'm the chair of the Book of the Year Committee, and our event today is co-sponsored by the Cuesta Book of the Year and the Academic Senate Faculty Lecture Series. We're happy to be talking about ethics in the news presented by the Cuesta Nursing faculty today. And we're taping it so people will be able to go back and see it later on. And I just wanted to highlight a couple of events that we're having for Book of the Year that are student and science focused that you might want to bring yourself and your students to. We have a panel on science, ethics, and HeLa cells with Cuesta and Cal Poly faculty happening April 12th, 11 to 1 p.m. in 5401. And there's flyers over there if you'd like to pick them up. And then we have a STEM Club showcase, a science fair, in the area of the campus student center courtyard on Thursday, March 23rd, 12 to 1:30 p.m. So, free pizza. And free lunch on the other one. So I will hand it over to our Marcia Scott from our nursing department, and she will introduce our fine panel today.
All right, so on behalf of the entire nursing faculty, we thank you for attending this faculty lecture series on current bioethical issues in the news. And I do want to start off with the privilege of introducing the faculty presenters today. And first we have Linda Harris. I'm going to have them stand so you can see them. Linda has been a nurse for 44 years. She's been a nurse for 44 years and a faculty member at Cuesta College for 19. She has worked as a critical care nurse and emergency room nurse, chief nursing officer, nursing instructor, nursing program director, and nursing and allied health division chair. Currently, Linda teaches advanced skills and medical surgical concepts to our 3rd and 4th semester students and oversees our skills lab and simulation lab. Next, we have, I want to introduce Tony Torrey. And Tony has been a nurse for 32 years and a faculty member at Cuesta College since 2000, 17 years. Tony has worked as a labor and delivery nurse and a hospital nurse educator before coming to Cuesta College. She obtained her PhD in 2010 with a focus on addiction studies. She currently is the division chair for nursing and allied health. And then we have Rick Staley. Rick has been a nurse for 29 years, mostly in critical care, and came to Cuesta in 2006 to begin his career as a nursing instructor. He brings a much-needed role model for our male nursing students in what has been predominantly known as a female profession. Rick sponsors a men in nursing club for the men in our nursing class, which occasionally gathers a female student as well. And Rick will be a speaker at an upcoming statewide men in nursing conference. In addition to his faculty role, Rick serves as the assistant director for our associate degree nursing program. Beth Johnson has been a nurse for 24 years and a faculty member at Cuesta College since 2012. She has worked in critical care and is now in her 5th year of teaching at Cuesta College. Beth's focus is neurological and renal nursing care for the 3rd semester students, and in the 4th semester she teaches leadership and professional skills that are essential to enter the workforce. Monica Millard has been a nurse for 17 years. She worked 6 years as a part-time clinical instructor for us before coming on full-time in 2013. Monica was granted tenure this spring. Monica teaches introductory nursing content in the 1st year of the program and instills the foundation of caring and passion that our students need throughout the program and to enter the nursing profession. Kif Mills is a Cuesta Associate Degree nursing graduate from 1993, so she's one of our alum. And she joined the Cuesta nursing faculty in 2015. She worked as a cardiac care nurse in a variety of healthcare settings and brings different perspectives into our nursing curriculum. Kif taught in our licensed vocational nursing program on the North County campus and in the RN programs at Ventura and Hartnell College before coming full-time with us in 2016. And then myself, Marcia Scott. I've been a nurse for 34 years. I grew up in Wisconsin and came to San Luis Obispo as a traveling nurse in 1985 and never left. I began teaching full-time in 1993, taught for 14 years, and I'm in the 10th year of being the director of nursing in LA. Time flies. So to begin our presentation, I wanted to first introduce what bioethical issues are and set the scene for what the faculty will be presenting. Bioethics is a field of study concerned with ethics and philosophical implications of certain biological and medical procedures, technology, and treatments. Biological and medical ethical situations have presented themselves as long as medicine has been in existence, essentially forever. To put this into perspective, I want to provide you with several examples of situations that have occurred within the last 100 years, which were deemed for the good of society at the time by the persons performing. Experimental injections of disease cells into the mentally ill or criminal population to research the immediate and long-term effects of the disease. Medication studies where patients received experimental drugs for their disease, while other patients in the same study received a placebo or pill with no active therapeutic effect. And neither of the two groups knew which medication they were receiving, but all were hopeful for a cure. Transplanting human and animal tissue to produce something. And keeping terminally ill patients alive beyond quality of care. To determine how medical treatments and technology would work for future patients in similar situations. Mankind benefited significantly from all of those above situations. Bioethics raises uncomfortable questions that have no clear-cut answers, causing quandaries in our world between the rights of individuals versus the overall benefits and merits to society. Bioethical issues impact every level of mankind, from individuals, families, hospitals, governments, society, and civilization. So this particular faculty lecture series on bioethics was generated by the College Book of the Year, The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. The book tells the story of a true and riveting bioethical situation that took place almost 70 years ago. In the 1950s, when cervical cancer cells were removed during a biopsy on Henrietta Lacks, a poor 31-year-old African-American patient, without her consent and without compensation to Henrietta or her family, by a physician who was eager to research cancer in advanced medicine. Henrietta Lacks was a living, breathing human being, a woman who was raising her family above all else despite the relentless tumor that was inside her, wreaking havoc on her health. Henrietta had not given consent for her cells to be used for any other purpose other than diagnosing her disease. Instead, the cells were removed from Henrietta's cervix, and they turned out to be unique and produced themselves indefinitely in laboratories, and they continue to survive today, almost 70 years later. Her cells have been shipped around the world to any researcher who requested them. Her cells became and continue to be the standard in labs used to research around the world. They can be found in Berkeley, UCLA, San Diego, San Francisco, and even local faculty members have used her cells to research. Henrietta's immortal cells were given the name HeLa, H-E-L-A, from the first two letters of her first and last names to keep her identity anonymous. Her HeLa cells have contributed greatly to the development of life-saving medical breakthroughs, including the polio vaccine, cancer and HIV treatments, and genetic research. Anti-cancer drugs are currently in early clinical trials today that use HeLa cells to be developed. All of this without Henrietta or her family knowing. Her family was not informed of the continuing research on her unique HeLa cells until 2 decades later, and it would take decades for them to realize the true story of what happened to their mother's cells and understand what HeLa really means to society today. Henrietta's story forced scientists and doctors to make sure that questions are addressed by patients and research participations. Since 1991, scientists and doctors have been governed by the Common Rule, which requires them to inform patients when they are participating in research and that their participation be completely voluntarily. Patients must sign consent forms which clearly state what research is being done, how long it will last, what potential risks there are, if there is compensation, and more. Henrietta's legend probes deeply into biological and ethical issues in medicine and raises many questions about the appropriateness of how medical research is accomplished and under what situations it's being done. This sets the scene for 3 current bioethical situations in the news that nursing faculty will present today. So first up we have Linda Harris and Beth Johnson talking about the California Right to Die law. Following them will be Monica Millard and Tony Torrey on mandatory vaccination, and we'll conclude with Kip Mills and Rick Staley on animal testing.
So part of my responsibility is to define the ethical principles that are surrounding bioethical issues. And so I'm going to do a brief overview of bioethical principles or ethical principles. Do understand that I am not an ethicist. I am a healthcare worker. I am a nurse. And so a lot of what I talk about gets colored through my own experience as a nurse. Probably one of the things we need to understand is what is an ethical dilemma. And an ethical dilemma is when we take these ethical principles, which are all equal in value, and when they are in conflict with each other, we have an ethical dilemma. And ethical dilemmas commonly, as Marsha mentioned, have no clear-cut answer. We also have an opportunity as individuals to value ethical principles based on our own core values, and that sort of informs our own choices and how we choose to define benefits and risks related to any ethical principle. One of the things that's very common within healthcare, and certainly I think within the public, is moral distress regarding ethical principles. And moral distress is really when you value an ethical principle and in trying to carry out that principle, the outcome is not clear or is inconsistent with your core value. It doesn't mean that what is going on is unethical. It just means that you're having distress in the application of ethical principles. It comes up commonly in the area of end-of-life issues, where sometimes the treatment that's being provided may be perceived as extending life beyond what is reasonable to maintain a quality of life, and then the healthcare worker may experience moral distress in the exercise because the families or the individual may have exercised their rights related to other ethical principles. And so you get in conflict with your own values and also in the application of values. So I'm going to briefly go over the ethical principles. So this is very brief. But the first one is autonomy, or the right of self-determination, independence, and freedom free from lies, restraint, or coercion. This is really at the core of the development of informed consent, or the ability for the individual to determine what they will accept in treatment, to be informed about treatment, and to consent to treatment. In the United States, this is highly valued as an ethical principle. We put a great amount of emphasis on autonomy. But we need to understand that that's not true everywhere, that that's a core value for us, but that's not necessarily a core value in all countries or in all cultures. Another ethical principle is beneficence, which means do or promote good for others, prevent or remove harm, and the charge is to balance benefits against risks. This principle is closely associated with paternalism, and sometimes can be talked about in terms of the ends justify the means. In other words, if there was a good outcome, then the steps to get there are deemed good. It was a good thing. But part of the challenge with this particular ethical principle is who defines what's good. So while I may perceive something as being good based on my values, that may not necessarily be perceived by Beth, my partner that I teach with, as good based on her values. And that speaks back to the principle of autonomy. Who decides what's good? Another ethical principle is one that I always have a hard time pronouncing, non-maleficence. I hope I said that right. And that principle is first, do no harm. I think a lot of people have heard this principle because this is a core principle behind the Hippocratic Oath that is very physician-centered. And it involves doing no harm intentionally or unintentionally, and includes avoiding harm as a consequence of doing good. The same challenge exists with this principle that does with beneficence, is who defines what harm is. So what I may perceive as harm may not be the same as someone else may perceive as harm. And that's where we get into challenges and application of these principles and try to define these variables. Fidelity. Fidelity is faithful to commitment to self and others, and accountability. And this is where privacy and confidentiality comes in. And I don't think anyone who has accessed healthcare anytime recently doesn't understand HIPAA. And that confidentiality right now in healthcare is huge. And every time you go to the doctor's office, you have to sign some document, so that we can talk to people, et cetera, because we are protecting your privacy. So HIPAA is really an offshoot of the principle of fidelity. Justice is the fair and equitable and appropriate treatment. It's fairness in the distribution of benefits and risks. And it also involves the principle of distributed justice, which understands that we have limited resources, and how do we then utilize those resources in an effective way when we know they are limited. It's like who gets what in terms of resources. This is really the principle that underlies a lot of discussions about rationing of healthcare. And people know me as being a little bit of a cynic and recognizing that while we don't call it rationing, we do ration healthcare every day and making decisions about who gets what treatment based on their ability, their insurance coverage and ability to pay. Yeah, Denise is over there going like this. Yeah, I have a little bit of a cynical edge. Sorry, I've been a nurse for 44 years. Veracity is truthfulness, or telling the truth. And we can certainly see that in the story of Henrietta Lacks of truthfulness. And again, while it seems really straightforward, of course we would tell the truth. We have to understand that and question ourselves, is it okay to tell the truth if in telling the truth it causes harm? And so that's one of the challenges in the application of these principles. And kind of leads me into Beth, who's going to talk about how these principles relate to the current right to die law in the state of California. Oh, but before we go, yeah. Which principle or rule is most important? Is autonomy and non-maleficence versus beneficence and justice? Which one is most important? Do we just approach decision-making considering relative benefits and burdens? And then we all need to think about how our individual values impact our decisions related to these issues. So that's our challenge.
Well, thank you very much, Linda. That was helpful. Hopefully that'll bring us forward so we can discuss right to dialogue or the end of life option. So, do we have the right? According to autonomy, we do have the right to elect this. As healthcare professionals, do we have the right to inform our patients that they do have the right, they have the right to choose? So, in support of SB 128, that's the California law that allows a resident of California to opt for the right to die. But, as healthcare professionals, how do we ensure that we're addressing all the ethical principles? This is a dilemma, a moral dilemma, distressing to us as nurses often. So we're going to start and just go down this list and think about it as I'm talking through it. What you would value, what would be your options? If I'm thinking that, you can now understand potentially how we as nurses and healthcare professionals also approach the same situation, because it does go to personal values as well. And as Linda and I have had discussions, that this is one of the moral distresses and dilemma that we have. So, autonomy, freedom to elect this option. That one seems pretty easy, right? But beneficence, now I have a term. Do good. Who decides what's good? How do we make a decision about that? And as healthcare professionals or just individuals, what does that mean to us? So the goal is to promote the total well-being of the person. Beneficence requires positive action to always act in the best interests of the person and the patient. The principle of beneficence is a primary goal of healthcare providers. According to the principle of beneficence, to prevent harm in respect to the law could be in conflict. What is good and who decides what is good? Does autonomy outweigh the obligation to prevent harm? I think you'll find that in the news there's been many, in fact, even yesterday there was a case in Massachusetts where they were discussing the option to end life. In Massachusetts, they're debating. It has been on the ballot, but it was, the people did not support that law going into place. An argument in court with a 65-year-old man who has prostate cancer, who would like to have some sort of option to make an election, to have the autonomy to choose when his end of life is. Right now, the judge has decided that he needs to ponder on it and think about it because the law is not in place to be protected. California, we have the option, but it's very specific. So, who decides what is good? Non-maleficence, do no harm. And this is very much in conflict with beneficence. Considering both when you are thinking about the end of life and the right to die. As a healthcare professional, this is very important to me. The goal is to do no harm, regardless of the benefit to others than the person. Harm cannot outweigh the benefit of the act. So in the case of Henrietta, was she harmed? We all benefited, clearly. Non-maleficence and beneficence are in conflict. Do no harm versus promote good. This is a difficult concept to understand the relationship of the right to die. As medical professionals, we cannot participate in the last act of the end of the patient's life under the principles of do no harm. This law has been put into place in reflection of how healthcare providers are affected by this law. Physicians are not required to participate in this election. So on autonomy, if you go to your physician and he says, I'm sorry, but you have about 4 months to live, you have breast cancer. It's invasive throughout your body. And you say to your doctor, oh, I heard about, since I'm a California resident, I have this option to elect to end my life on my own terms. Your physician can say, I'm sorry, but I will not be able to participate in that. The physician also does not have to send you to another professional that would be willing to agree to that. And this is part of beneficence and non-maleficence, in that the physician has the option to make a value statement of their own and say it will not participate. Veracity. Veracity is the truthfulness. That's the obligation of healthcare providers to inform the patient of their options. So the physician does not value the end-of-life option. Does that physician have the option to not be truthful? No. That physician, based upon our principles and us as nurses, we must be truthful and say, yes, this is an option. You can choose this. So we must remember that truthfulness is also one of the underlying, very important ethical principles. And you can't imagine anybody here that would prefer the physician to be untruthful or your nurse to be untruthful when they're talking to you. Justice. Justice in relationship to the right to die. This one's tough because the distribution of the right to die is not equal. You must be a resident of the state that has a law that allows you to choose this option for this to take place. So it's not equitable. Fidelity, faithfulness, accountability, and loyalty. And fidelity really is where the physician is obligated to tell you the truth, but not obligated to participate. And I, am a nurse, am obligated to tell you the truth if you happen to be the patient at my bedside, that you have chosen to invoke your right to elect the end of life on your own terms. I am not obligated to participate. I thought this was a great picture, even though this is from Oregon and their right to die law. Give me liberty at my own death. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the parts of this law. I don't know how many of you are aware of the right to die law. But one thing I did want to point out to you, since we're talking about this law, is this is not a new law that just came up in 2000 or 2006. We've actually been discussing this debate since the 1950s. What's the quality of life? Do we have the option to choose as humans? 1960, that's when it gained wider knowledge throughout the United States. I don't know if anybody remembers Terry Schiavo or the Nancy Cruzan case. I know Linda does. 1970s, Karen Ann Klingler. She was a 21-year-old that was in vegetative state. It was all over the news. And as a nurse, I know now, but in 1970, I didn't have a clue because I wasn't old enough to really understand what was happening. 1997, that's when Oregon first looked at death with dignity. But it wasn't until 2014 that they were able to get the law passed. But in 2006, they were looking at physicians that were participating and felt that that was a concern, that they were prescribing medications that would aid in the patient's death. 2016, and actually it was June of 2016, so it's actually a relatively new law. It came into, it was passed in the state of California. So what I wanted to also help with is that this is important
for you to understand how this law has been invoked into the state of California and somehow is addressing the principles, ethical principles. So the patient must be a resident of the state of California. The patient must be competent, mentally competent, but external emotional factors like depression are excluded. The patient must have 2 verbal requests 15 days apart, followed by a written request by 2 people, including 1 non-relative. The patient must self-administer the drug. And this is where physicians and nurses, we don't participate in this end of life. The patient must be able to give their own medication. And that means that the relative, the wife, the husband, the sister, mother, brother, cousin, is not to give that life-ending medication, that the patient must be able to give their own medication. 2 doctors must agree on the patient's diagnosis and medical competency before the prescription is given. The law applies only to patients who have a diagnosis with 6 months or less to live. And the patient must also sign the form within 48 hours prior to taking the medication. Obviously, a prescription must be written by a physician that agrees with the patient's right to elect this decision. But the patient must make that decision within 48 hours prior to them ingesting the medication.
Are you open for questions or comments?
Sure. I was checking to make sure I wasn't pulled out.
The option to die. The problem in this area, in this county, is that there are no doctors who will write the order. So you might as well forget that whole idea. Unless you can starve yourself to death or dehydrate yourself like Terry Shiloh.
Right. Which we as medical professionals cannot participate in either. So thank you for asking that question. That does speak back to the principles of truthfulness, or very, very much of veracity and fidelity, in that we as healthcare professionals should provide you with the other options. And when I was looking at research, actually there aren't very many people, there's a small margin of people in the state of Oregon, mostly because this law is so big in the state of California, that have actually used the prescription medication to end their life. A large number of people have been forwarded to hospice, however. So there are other options if you do elect that potentially would be beneficial in our county, but you're right. And that speaks to the moral principles and values that we as healthcare professionals have. So the law's there, but you have to have someone, actually 2 physicians, I believe.
And you have to somebody to carry it out.
Any other questions?
Do you know how our law and the law, Oregon's law differ?
I didn't really do a lot of research on that, but what the law in Oregon allows for more participation from healthcare professionals, but the patients still must elect to take their drug themselves. They have to be able to do that and be competent. Washington State as well. There are some cases in where in fact, those 2 states, Washington and Oregon, are keeping track, and they're called abuses against the right to die law. And so where they feel that might have been coercion, or that the family or people that would inherit beneficially via finances have medicated the person so they died. And then what I read today was interesting. There's actually a few patients that have been rescued from taking the medication. For example, a gentleman who took the medication and his wife was distraught with the outcome and called 911. And he was sent to the hospital, given life-saving, procedures and then died a week later in the nursing home. So those things that happened, there were like 2 cases of that.
Another comment, there is an agency that travels around and will give lectures to, you got a letter to our church, I think at our church, and this one was offering to come and discuss that option, the option time. And heard her, but I don't know what her objective is. I'm not sure, it's a pretty thing.
I think just knowledge, but I will say, if you do look at the California state law, SB 128, there's an organization, and if you are interested in electing this as an option, it goes through a whole list of ways to talk to your physician, what your other options avenues would be if your physician didn't have the agreement with you that they would participate in even starting the into life. So there are some good information if you just, and it's .org. Okay.
So I'm Tony Torrey, and you see our topic. The ethical implications concerning vaccine-related public health policy have been at the forefront of much recent debate. This is the issue that Monica and I will discuss. The ethics of mandatory pediatric vaccination versus the right of parents to opt out. And our charge is to present these without you having any idea if we have a bias or not. So we'll see how we do, okay? We thought for the purposes of education, we would focus on one particular communicable disease. Measles is the most transmissible virus that we know. It is so contagious that 90% of non-immune people who are exposed to an individual with measles will become infected. We know that it spreads to others when an infected person coughs or sneezes. But what you may not realize is that if an infected person coughs or sneezes and then leaves the room, the measles virus can survive for up to 2 hours. So an individual who comes into that room and breathes the contaminated air or touches the contaminated surface can become infected. Diseases that vaccines prevent can be dangerous. Measles can result in significant complications. It can cause ear infections, which can result in permanent hearing loss. Pneumonia is the chief cause of death in children who get measles, young children. Encephalitis, or swelling of the brain, can lead to convulsions and leave a child deaf or with an intellectual disability. Measles may cause a pregnant woman to give birth prematurely or to give birth to a low birth weight infant. Children routinely get their first measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, known as the MMR, at around 12 months of age. Then the second dose is usually administered before they start kindergarten. The MMR vaccine itself is associated with complications. The most common side effects are relatively minor. These are side effects of the injection where you will have redness, swelling, pain at the site. But there are some more serious adverse events following the MMR vaccination that include seizures, severe headaches, joint pain, vomiting, double vision. Then there are severe irreversible complications that are associated with the measles vaccine. These include, I just picked a few, encephalitis, lupus, meningitis, pancreatitis, diabetes, and rarely even death. Now, I checked the federal vaccine adverse events database this morning so I could give you up-to-date information. And it says, as of today, and they started doing this accounting in 1990. So as of today, there have been 7,965 serious adverse events in connection with the measles vaccine since 1990. Of these, 416 were deaths, and over half of the deaths occurred in children under 3 years of age. So This helps us to understand parental concerns about safety. And it's their concern about safety is issues such as these that have led increasing numbers of parents to limit, delay, or refuse vaccination for their children. In early 2015, Disneyland became the focal point for a large measles outbreak that spread across much of the United States. Thousands of people were exposed to individuals diagnosed with measles, including some who had been intentionally unvaccinated. During outbreaks of vaccine-preventable disease, compulsory vaccination is often discussed as a last resort to counter vaccine refusal. In the months that followed, we Californians engaged in heated debate over the proposed school vaccine bill as it made its way through the state legislature. And in July of 2015, our governor signed Senate Bill 277, which is an immunization law aimed at quelling the spread of communicable disease. The legislation stipulates that for students attending public or private schools to skip immunizations, their parents must provide a written medical exemption from a physician. Under the bill, families who do not want their children to receive vaccines for non-medical reasons are required to homeschool their children. This law is being hailed by its proponents as a victory for public health. However, many Californians are vehemently opposed to a mandate they consider a violation of their parental rights. So as Linda said, autonomy is frequently more heavily weighted than the other ethical principles in resolving ethical issues. And respect for the autonomous choices of other persons is one of the most deeply rooted concepts in moral thinking. Viewing compulsory vaccination from the standpoint of autonomy, the ethical imperative is choice and the preferences and needs of the parents. Limiting the individual right of a parent to refuse immunization could be interpreted as a violation of the parent's civil liberties. We can further recognize that compulsory immunization infringes the autonomy of parents to make choices about child rearing. Now, in general, in our society, we accept that parents have to live with the choices they make for their children. And it is usual for us to respect such parental choices, unless doing so seriously endangers the health of the child. There are instances when the state may intervene on behalf of the interest of children. And an example of this is consider the use of car seats. These have been made compulsory as it is deemed the public cannot be trusted to consistently comply unless there is a degree of coercion. However, there is an important difference between immunization, which involves the injection of foreign material into an individual, and the compulsory use of car seats. Compelling a parent against their will to have their child immunized could be seen as constituting a physical assault that has the potential of resulting in a seriously adverse outcome, whereas requiring parents to place their children in car seats when driving is substantially less invasive. In this analysis, compulsory immunization could be viewed as breaching the principle of non-maleficence, in which the ethical duty is to do no harm.
So I'm Monica Millard, and once again presenting the non-biased side of vaccination, which is beneficence. That's right. Okay, so one of the things that Tony had emphasized was the transmission of measles and how contagious this disease can be. And we did have outbreaks of measles. You've seen the headlines, right? So these were some of the headlines that presented in California. So, according to the CDC, measles was actually declared eliminated in the year 2000. due to a highly effective vaccination program. However, measles reappeared in 2014, and California recorded its highest number of measles cases since 1995. Now, to emphasize what Tony said, the exposure of measles and the spread of measles that occurred at the happiest place on earth, which is Disneyland, unfortunately spread not just within our state, but to 6 other states, as well as Mexico and Canada. So patients affected by this measles outbreak spread from 6 weeks to 70 years of age. So as Tony had said, this was kind of the breaking point where then Governor Jerry Brown decided to sign a bill, Senate Bill 277, which passed that legislation, removing the option for individuals to refuse vaccinations based on religious or philosophical beliefs. This current bill, as it is now, physicians need to identify the vaccines that are being exempted and whether that medical exemption is permanent or temporary, and if it's temporary, when the expiration date of that exemption will be. This law became effective last year on July 1st. Now, as you can imagine, Senate Bill 277 is a contentious debate because it is public health versus the personal choice, right? So our personal choice to make a decision whether or not our children receive vaccines. So these speaks to 2 principles. Tony presented autonomy, and I'm presenting beneficence. So, let's see what slide I have here. So as Tony said, vaccines now are mandated for school entry, and otherwise children have to be taught at home. However, this principle also addresses public health. So the new law addresses the ethical principle of beneficence, which means that we are doing or actively promoting good, not just for ourselves, but for the greater good and for the greater community. So Senate Bill 277 is viewed through this lens because it views vaccinations as a critical component in maintaining the public's health and well-being. So according to an article by the American Journal of Public Health published in 2015, highly infectious diseases such as measles requires a high vaccination threshold to prevent its transmission. Herd immunity is what they call the protection of a whole community from a disease and breaks the chain of transmission. The more members of a human herd that are immunized to disease, the better protected the community will be from an outbreak of that disease. Because measles is extremely contagious and can spread through the air, the immunity threshold needed to protect a community is 95%. This threshold not only prevents the spread of infection to others, but also extends protection to those that cannot be vaccinated, such as infants, immunocompromised individuals, such as patients that may suffer from cancer, or individuals who have incomplete vaccination status because of medical conditions. Health organizations such as the CDC and the World Health Organization, as well as our own healthcare providers who oversee the health of these vulnerable patients, view vaccinations as supporting and benefiting the greater good. So, finding the balance between autonomy and beneficence is an intractable problem in our society. However, it continues to be a contentious debate, and that ongoing conversation is what keeps this vaccine policy and these ethical principles at its forefront in our public health discussion. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kim, and this is Rick, and we're going to talk about animal research. And you guys might think, well, what does that have to do with Henrietta Lacks? right? Because animal research seems like it's a far away from there. But Henrietta Lacks really introduced a new way of performing research, and that was not with her own consent, of course, as what Marcia said, the cells were taken against her consent. But she gave us like the cell that never dies, and so scientists were able to use that in the science laboratory to perform experiments on human cells that they had never been able to do before. They couldn't, before Henrietta Lacks cells, they couldn't keep the cells alive in order to do the experiments on them. So this relates to animal research because animal research is a traditional way that we've always studied medicine and medical procedures. And so the way that research and science have progressed in medicine has really extraordinarily blossomed and may provide some better ways of, or different ways, I shouldn't say better because we're doing non-judgmental, but some different ways of looking at medical research. And that's what we came to talk about today.
So we all have our own biases in this, and again, Kip and I have tried to put all those aside, and Kip is much more well-versed in this than I've been. I've started looking at this for a couple months now. I've looked at some materials regarding animals and research, and some of it's clearly disturbing and upsetting to think about some of these things. It's kind of like any field that you haven't ever looked at. When you really look into it, you might have some biases when you're done looking at it. But what I like to do is just try to summarize some of the arguments for the proponents of animal research and the opponents of animal research. A little bit more than what we have here. In general, basically, the proponents say that treatments save lives and that have been developed through animal research. A few of the other things that aren't mentioned here on this slide is that in the past 100 years, proponents say that most of the discoveries that we've had have come from animal research. And I'll just name a couple for you. The discovery of insulin. And I can remember back when I was a little bit younger nurse, we were using different types of insulins that actually said beef or pork on the insulin containers. So we were actually looking at different types of insulins that were clearly taken from an animal source. But that's obviously a very important discovery for diabetic patients. Many vaccines have come from animal research. Brain injury, which is kind of near and dear to my heart. That's something that I did as a graduate student. My thesis project was on brain injury and long-term recovery of patients that I'd actually taken care of. Animals provide kind of a whole body system, so we're not just looking at cells on a petri dish. We're looking at a whole body system with organs and things that are similar, especially mammals, similar to us. In fact, some of the animals that we use for research, mice for instance, chimpanzees, share about 98 to 99% of the DNA that we have. So it can be very similar in nature. A lot of our ethical considerations prevent us from doing testing on human beings. And we have pretty stringent guidelines, especially here in the United States for that. So we'll talk about some of the opponents' views regarding that, but some people feel that we're almost too stringent in that process. One of the things that I hadn't thought about until I looked at this research is that some animals, like mice for instance, have a very short life cycle, so 2 to 3 years. So if we're studying something like cancer treatment, a chemotherapy treatment or something like that, it could be beneficial to people in a short amount of time. We might not want to study that in a human being that could last a lot longer than a mouse, for instance, that could live maybe 2 years, and we could study that in a much shorter amount of time. So that's kind of an interesting thing that I hadn't considered. And proponents do say that we treat animals humanely. I think by and large we treat them better in this country than in other countries because of some of the guidelines that we have. On the opponents' view, and there's lots of stuff that goes along with this, but a lot of people that are opponents of animal testing say that the animals are treated inhumanely, cruelly. There are abuses in spite of all the guidelines that we have in place. That there are alternative methods out there, and that we don't have to do animal testing for everything that we do. though a lot of it is required by our agencies. And then drugs that do pass animal testing tests are not always safe on humans. And I'll give you the example of the thalidomide, that's a tough one to pronounce, thalidomide tragedy that happened in the 1950s. Thalidomide was a sedative sleep drug that people were taking, and moms that had taken it, I believe they had to be pregnant at the time, ended up with children with birth defects, so short limbs and things like that, and there were quite a few people that were affected by that, again, in the 1950s. So even though they had been tested on animals, it didn't translate to humans, unfortunately. Another example of that is Vioxx, used for arthritis. In spite of the fact that it had been tested on animals, there were still about 27,000 myocardial infarctions or heart attacks that happened after the drug was approved. So just a couple of examples. We'll get to this in a little bit more detail in a minute, but about 95% of the animals that are involved in testing are not protected by some of these agencies. So it's only about 5% that really are protected. And then finally, some of these tests and experiments don't reliably predict results in human beings. And some of the examples that I saw for that were drugs that related to strokes or cerebral vascular infarctions. In spite of the fact that they did well with animal trials, they still hadn't done well with human beings.
So the facts, USDA categorizes animal research by what type of pain might be caused. So they have 3 different types. So the animal might have experience pain during the research, but they might be given medications to alleviate it. That's one type. The animal might experience pain and might not be given medications to alleviate it because it would interfere with the research. That would be the reason why they wouldn't be given pain medicine. Or then the third type is animals that wouldn't have any pain with the research type. So that's how the USDA categorizes animal research. But I want to just mention in the FDA, as far as who approves our medications, it's absolutely required to test the drug on 2 different animal species. So it's a part of our process. And so every medication that's used is tested on at least 2 different animals, and it's really early in the process. So what they are testing for are safety. Is the product safe to be used on animal or human? Is it efficacy? Is it efficient? Does it work for the disease process? So they would have to mimic that in animals. So like if it was an antibiotic for an infection, they would have to have that type of infection. They'd have to cause an animal and give the antibiotic. And that's how they would test it. Or liability also is the same. Sometimes the drug companies are liable for the effects of putting a new drug on the market. So we want to decrease the liability and the costs associated with that. So other things are tested. It might be not medications, but it could be household cleaners, it could be cosmetics, skin lotions, shampoo. They can use animals to test on.
I just noticed that my shirt doesn't match my pants today. I don't know how I got the house that way, but anyway. So I want to talk a little bit about the picture that's in the corner of that slide, which again was kind of disturbing to me to see something like that. But just know that there's about 25 million animals that are used for research in the United States, and again, only about approximately 5% of those animals that are used for research are regulated by any agency. So we have to ask the question, is the presumed pain, suffering, or deaths of these animals worth the presumed human benefit of what we're testing them for? And I'll comment about that photo. PETA, the group that's for the ethical treatment of animals, in 1981 they took this photo. Some of their undercover folks took this photo in a place called the Institute for Biological Research in Silver Springs, Maryland. And I guess there were all kinds of things going on. One of the things that was happening with these monkeys was that they were engaged in self-mutilation, And I just wanted to kind of give you a human equivalent of that. If you've ever known somebody who's into cutting, and I've known several adolescents that have done that, it's usually somebody actually cutting parts of their body, their arms or whatever, to get some sort of physical or emotional release from their pain, their emotional pain. So this clearly had to be something that was an emotional stressor on this animal, because obviously self-mutilation is not something that's natural to that species. So they must have been very stressed. And the director of this institute was brought up on charges of about 12 cruelty offenses at that time. Yeah. I also wanted to show you with this link. There's a pretty neat website here. I think that this PowerPoint will be available. This computer for us. Your Wi-Fi is working today. Anyway, it's a state-by-state breakdown of different types of animals that are used in research and the numbers that are used. So if you're at all interested in that, I've got a pretty fascinating slide. If we look at California, we've got a pretty high number of animals there in total, and then it breaks it down per species as well, too.
This is 5%.
Okay, and yeah, that's a good point. So this is, again, the 5% of the animals that are regulated.
By the Animal Welfare Act. So for, talk about humans, scientists really overwhelmingly agree that using animals in research is really necessary for good research outcomes. 90% of them say it's essential. In the public opinion, from a Gallup poll in 2013, 56% of the public believes that using animals in research is morally acceptable. And so we're talking about ethics and ethical decision-making. So 56% believe that's okay, and 39% believe that it's not okay, that's morally wrong, and that would be weighing those ethical principles in an individual manner to come up with the answer for that. None of us can say for another what our answer would be for that. I mean, some of it depends on our personal experience with illness, and some drug that miraculously saved our very loved one. So there are a couple of organizations. PCRM is the Physicians Committee for Research, Responsible Medicine, and they work with trying to have training programs for physicians and nurses and other universities not use live animals for like dissection or for other types of things. So there's a lot of different aspects on it. NAVS is also a National Anti-Vivisection, which is cutting of animals. So they have really great websites, and I encourage you to check them out. There's a lot of really good information about them. You know, as each of us individually, we may have a spiritual or religious, hopefully we do have a component of our lives, and different religions view our role in the world for animals in different ways. Some of them might say, a person might believe that an animal is put here to serve me, and I can use that animal in service of my goals as a human. And other religions might say, well, I was put on this earth to be a steward of animals and to help the animals on the earth. So there are just different ways of looking at it, but sometimes there is a spiritual component to how we view animals' place in our world. So, and for PETA, as Rick was talking about, as People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, that 1981 lab that they went in and took pictures in was their first big operation, and they're still active in the world today, especially in this country. So for me, the real question is, does animal research translate effectively into human medicine? And that's a question that's very difficult to answer because it's not clear-cut what the animal research, the result of it, and how it translates into actually good medicine for us. But enough scientists believe that this is important, that it's still very much part of our medical procedures and medical medicine, that what we study.
So another question comes up, does the necessity of this type of research make it ethical? You'll have to answer that question probably for yourself. Are guidelines for experimenting with people with some of these things too strict? And you've all probably heard of friends or extended family or somebody you know going to another country for some sort of treatment because because they approve their medications much more quickly maybe than we do in this country. Again, that's another one of those hot topics that I won't try to delve into except to ask the question. And are there reasonable alternatives to animal testing as well? That's the other part that we want to ask. Or is this absolutely necessary?
On this one. So there are some different things, and Henrietta Lacks was really instrumental, as I said, against her knowledge, with providing us some alternatives and using different types of tissue cultures to study the medications on using perfused organs or having tissues grow into organs, using slices of tissues to grow things in cellular and subcellular fractions. These are all things that the scientific community is working on, medical research developing, and also using 3D models for simulation, computer model simulations. And for example, so simulation, like what we use in the nursing program for making a not real environment seem real, and is that going to be sufficient? So we use it in our nursing program as a key part of our training students in how to function in a really chaotic and busy world in the hospital. So for example, if a doctor is going to learn how to intubate or put a breathing tube into a patient, can they do that in a simulation environment, or do they need to use a pig or a monkey or an animal to do that on? So those are some of the issues that medicine faces. The idea about reduce is trying to use less animals, and that would be one way to use simulation programs, to use less animals to experiment on. Refining means using the animals for only the things that we need to use them for experimentation, and not doing, because not all animal research, it turns out to be good research. So what is really necessary for us to do? And then possibly replacing with some of these things, ways of the future. And then consumer decision making about what do they want to have happen in the world also.
So I wanted to try to sum this up for us and give you a little scenario that might kind of tie some of this together. And I'll give you just a little background on this before I give you the scenario. But when I was a nursing student 30 some odd years ago, I spent 2 days in a burn unit in Fresno, and it was a really significant experience in that I still remember some of the patients. I remember the name of one of the technicians who was just amazing with the patients. But it was an experience that was life-changing, in that I recognized how difficult it was for a patient to go through a significant burn experience. I still remember one of the kids that had a pot accidentally poured right down his neck and back, and burns that he had to have debrided every single day. It was a painful experience for him every single day. And I just remember there was some talk about him getting a little hooked, a little intoxicated with the nitrous oxide, and I just thought to myself, so what? Let him do that to get through this experience. Anyway, so I've spent some time in a situation like that for just 2 days, and I couldn't imagine doing that every single day like the staff did. So I want to leave you with this scenario. What if one of your loved ones, and you can just take a minute to kind of imagine somebody who's really significant in your life, a spouse, a child, a grandchild, was burned significantly in an accident. And you're faced with a choice now. You could give them a med that's been tested on animals, and by that I mean that the animals were actually burned themselves to test this drug. Or you could give them a med that has not been or treatment that has not been tested on animals, but it was tested on tissue, just tissue. What would your decision be? And I'll just leave it at that.
We don't expect an answer.
Yeah, I'm not expecting an answer, but any questions or comments?
So in closing, we want to thank you for attending our faculty lecture series on bioethical issues in the news today. And our intent was to broaden your understanding of medical issues and how complex they can be. Ethical issues have no simple answers, as we've all pointed out. Bioethical situations always involve two opposing forces, and neither one is right or wrong. Although there are perspectives that make the situations feel right or wrong to individuals and society. As you leave today, we ask that you reflect on how you feel about these situations that have been presented today. And we ask you to think about how you feel about ethical situations that you encounter. Thank you.
One question that came to mind, the right to die, and as lady pointed out, there's nobody in this area. So how would you proceed if you live here and you or a family member, do you move to San Francisco, do you move to Berkeley?
Well, what you would probably would go to website for the option, like option.org, and they can help you. But you know, in my research, there was Brittany Maynard. She actually moved to Oregon to elect this because California at that point had not decided to invoke the law. And so, you know, that is true. You could be forced to move to an area where that could be an option. But that is concerning. And you know, is there a way to find or to force physicians to agree with your autonomy? I can't see that as happening. As a employee also of the hospital, because I work per diem, we of course had an education curriculum module to work in the same place that came out, and we were mandated to take the education, and it was in relationship to this law to life and what our role would be and what the physician's role would be. So facilities in our area have taken the time to educate employees and nurses and physicians, but are the doctors mandated?
I think one of the problems too is in our area, some of the background of the hospitals don't allow that kind of help. I think that's a big issue.
Well, that is part of the law too, that does speak to that, and it does say that if I'm working for, you know, a Catholic hospital that doesn't have that as a value, that while I'm working at the hospital and for the hospital, I cannot participate. But it doesn't. It also says that the physician, if they had their own separate office, that they could participate. So the hospital themselves cannot deny the physician that value.
Well, they probably can't, but there's that subtle little message.
Absolutely, it's a small thing.
And I think the person does have the only option we have to us in this area is either move, like you said, or do a Terry Schreiber, you know, because she was not given anything to help her die. She was just simply starting.
Right. And I think we do have, and that's what the hospitals and the physicians and the nurses in our area are aware of, is that we do have hospice, and hospice should be offered if you said, I want to choose the end of life option with an SB 128, that's what I want. And then you, in distress, trying to find a physician to fulfill that, actually have to find two. That hopefully through fidelity, your physician says, I don't believe in this SB 128, but what I'm willing to do is I'm willing to offer you some other options. And that's actually what the research said, is that there are so many more patients in Washington and Oregon that we're referred to hospice to help them to be comfortable. Because most everyone, I think it's probably that fear of being vegetative or lingering and being in pain or being a burden to our family. Those are all the things that we as individuals concern ourselves with. And hospice can be helpful in that. So,
well, yeah, hospice is a good, it's definitely a good option.
It's an option, yeah.
It just doesn't achieve what the
right. It does not. It does not. And I want you to know that do go look. But I watched many interviews of people that really felt like this degree of relief, knowing that they could choose that in 48, they could write in 48 hours, this is what I want, and kind of say goodbye, and then take this lethal dose of medication. So I think another really important part to remember, it is a relatively new law, and just because today we don't have physicians in our community that agree with it, they may be changing their mind right now or in the next few years. So, and that's why the organization